Welcome, everyone. We're here again for the 5th time in 4 years. This is my 5th time giving a lecture on the Israeli election. Sometimes I've shared that in a few of the times with Professor Alon Tal or with Professor Eli Rekes. But this time I'm on my own, so quite frequent, too frequent lectures on the Israeli elections. I first wanted to thank our sponsors and co-sponsors. So I'm Yael Aronoff, by the way. I'm a professor at James Madison College and director of the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, which is a sponsor of this. But our co-sponsors also include James Madison College, the College of Social Science, the College of Arts and Humanities, the International Studies and Programs, the Asian Studies Center, the Office of Institutional Diversity, the Political Science Department, and the History Department. I think I've gotten, and Culture, Arts, and Letters, I think I've gotten everybody, so we are really happy to have broad support across the university for these lectures. I know this is being live streamed as well, and so some of the people on live stream are kind of probably Israel Studies scholars who are colleagues who are listening in, and just to let them know, most of the audience are students who are relatively new to Israeli politics, so I'm trying to juggle kind of multiple audiences just to let you know and to bear with me in terms of how I try to pitch this lecture. So as many of you know, Israel is a very polarized society and very polarized politically. And so one of the reasons we've had 5 elections in 4 years is precisely that, is you have a very polarized society. And as many of you know, it's a parliamentary democracy in which often over 12 parties are competing with each other to form a coalition. And when you have 12 parties competing in elections, you never had the case, as we've had in the United States in our elections, where of course you need over 50% of the vote. Someone wins that, and then they become president in the United States, of course. In this case, often the highest voting party will get 28% of the vote, 25% of the vote, 30% of the vote, right? And then they have to form a coalition with lots of different parties that are ideologically different from them. And so that each time we have a parliament with 120 members who are in parliament. And so in order to form that coalition, let's say your party won 30 seats or 32 seats or 34 seats, right? You need to form a coalition with a set of other parties to get over 60 seats in the parliament. And so that's what's going on now, right? So you had the Likud party on November 1st win the most votes compared to the other many parties who were competing, but they're nowhere near enough to get that over 60, and so they have to negotiate with other parties in order to form that coalition. Right, so what you've seen in the past 5 years is any time then, let's say you have 62 seats and 2 or 3 or 4 people defect and leave, the government can collapse, and it does, and new elections are held, right? So that's part of the reason you have a 5th election in 4 years, and because you have these blocks that often are relatively equal to each other in the last 5 years. So you have these 2 blocks in the political culture, which you might define in different ways, where you get relatively the same votes for in every single election for the last 5 years. So for instance, you might define it as kind of center-left versus center-right politically. And what does that mean in the Israeli context? It means something different in every country. In the Israeli context, it has traditionally had some bearing to whether your party is for a 2-state solution, for Israel living alongside an independent Palestinian state, where Israel would have to withdraw from the vast majority of the West Bank and so forth, right? So that has been one defining thing between the left and the right in Israel. But over the past few years, the prioritization of that issue has diminished. There's been a growing kind of center, And sometimes that center-right, center-left gets a little more blurred on those kinds of issues. Traditionally, it also meant in Israel that the left, let's say, Zionist parties had been socialist, and on the right they had been capitalist. That has changed too, as most of the parties have become capitalist parties, but they still are living in a state that has universal health care and that has a greater social safety net than we have in the United States. But in terms of degrees of what people want, that still sometimes divide those two blocks. Another thing that divides those two blocks more so in the past 5 years is to what extent, if Israel defines itself as a democracy and a Jewish state, how does it deal with the tensions between those two things? And some of the parties emphasize more the Jewish nature of the state, and some of the parties may not all, not the three Arab, mostly Palestinian parties in Israel, don't necessarily emphasize the Jewish nature of the state, but all the Zionist parties or majority Jewish parties will emphasize that to different degrees. But those that might characterize themselves on the center left might emphasize more that it's also a country for all its citizens, and therefore emphasize more individual rights and minority rights and checks and balances in the city and in the state, and having a strong Supreme Court to check that majority rule in the Knesset, right? Where those in the more right bloc are more concerned about being restricted by the Supreme Court and want to weaken the check on the legislature and on majority rule and want to weaken the Supreme Court. So those are a variety of things that have kind of differentiated what we would call the two major blocs in the past few years that have been getting relatively equal votes on both ends. And another thing that's differentiated the two blocs is essentially politics have become much more personalized, and with Benjamin Netanyahu have been the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, what's happened in the past 4 years, in the past 5 elections, is much of it also depends on whether you're for Netanyahu or you're anti-Netanyahu. And so whether you're considered to be on the right or far right bloc, you're for Netanyahu of the Likud party, which has been the major party on the right in Israel, or whether you're in this bloc that's opposing Netanyahu being prime minister, a majority who have not been on the right traditionally, but some people in the right, and even from Likud, that are already have had it with Netanyahu, right? And part of the reason might be his longevity. Part of the reason is over the past few years he's faced indictments and now on trial for breach of trust, bribery, and fraud, right? So some of those, even in his own party, are saying, you know, we don't want to be with Netanyahu anymore, and they have come to the opposing Netanyahu bloc. So there are kind of blurs between these two blocs, but those are some of the things that characterize these two blocs. And what you see in the past 5 elections is that approximately the same number of people in each and every election are voting for each separate bloc. So what is actually happening in each of the 5 elections is you see more of a shift in terms of which parties are voted for within each bloc rather than shifts among the two blocs, right? So that's what we're often seeing. And so this is what happened again on November 1st in this 5th election. So in this election, by the way, you had over 71% of Jewish Israelis voting. Usually you have very high voting rates in Israel. You had almost, I think, 55% of Arab Israelis, most of whom are Palestinian citizens of Israel. You also have Druze and Bedouin citizens of Israel that comprise about 21% of the population. They were voting about 55%, which we just had an American election. What is our rate? It's probably about that. I should know. Often I do a comparison. But it was about 10% higher rate than it was a year ago, whereas about 45% for that population. So you have relatively higher voting rates, but what you see in the vote is there's only a difference between the two blocks of 0.01% of those who voted is what separates the votes of one bloc versus the other. So again, it points to extremely tight races among the blocs. and repeatedly the same kind of absolute votes, even though they're spread among different parties within a bloc, right? So that's just kind of a little bit of an introduction. And Likud, by the way, who of course won the most votes and won 32 seats in the new Knesset, actually got fewer votes on November 1st than it did a year ago. So one question is, why then, when we have such continuity in some respects over the past 5 elections, do we see a real significant difference in the likelihood of who's going to form this new coalition government? And the likelihood of this new coalition government is that it'll be the most right-wing with far right-wing extremist parties in it, and the most religious coalition government than Israel has ever had in its history. So you have a continuity in kind of blocs that are voting, but a very different outcome this time in terms of the nature of the coalition government that is likely to be formed in the next month. There's about a month that they have to form the coalition. So what can help us explain that, right? On one hand, Yesh Atid, the party, a centrist party, did very well. This is the party of Yair Lapid, who was the prime minister for the last 4 months. And he was from the centrist party. They did very well. I think they got 24 seats. I'm just going to check. Yeah, 24 seats. So their support was raised. Even in the 4 months that they were in power, so to speak, and the prime minister was in power, they pointed to several what they thought were successes in the 4 months that he'd been prime minister. So one such success was the perceived success among many Israelis of the 3-day operation between Israel and Islamic Jihad in May, June, was it? Very recently, Israel successfully negotiated a maritime border with Lebanon, which included gas drilling deals. That was perceived as a success. They had brought in a lot of Ukrainian immigrants who were now moving into Israel. They funded in a more higher rate Holocaust survivors in Israel that often actually had been neglected. They had newer programs for soldiers suffering from PTSD. They introduced national service for everyone over 18 so that you could either do national service or go to the military, which would be a significant difference for ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel who often were not mandated to serve, as Palestinian citizens had not been mandated either to serve. And you also had kind of in schools for ultra-Orthodox Jews who have their own schools, which they focus on religion, of course, they would mandate courses in math and science. So they were developing all these projects on which they ran. And they did pretty well in this election. So what happened, right, when you had just 0.01% difference in the voting between the blocs? Two things that happened were the two smaller parties in Israel didn't make the 3.25% threshold of support that you need in order to get seats in the Knesset. It used to be that Israel had the lowest threshold in the world of votes that you need. I should know, I think it was 1.5%, that was 2% at one point. And then it was raised to 3.25%. It's still one of the lower thresholds in the world for how many seats you need to enter a parliament. And the Meretz party, which is the leftmost Zionist party in Israel, which has been alive for the past 30 years, it very much emphasizes individual civil rights and human rights and is very much urgently trying to pursue a two-state solution and so forth. They've been around for 30 years, and for the first time in 30 years, they missed getting the threshold by about 3,800 votes, and therefore the 151,000 people that voted for them, their votes were lost, right? So even though you have equal voting among the blocs, those votes were lost because that party, for the first time in 30 years, didn't meet the threshold. Why didn't it meet the threshold is, another question. One reason is that when you have smaller parties and you have a party that's in danger of not meeting the threshold, then sometimes it's advisable to form an alliance or bloc with another party to assure that no one will miss the threshold. And it could have done that with the traditional Labour Party, which used to be the biggest party in Israel, and until the late 70s, for the first 30 years of Israel history, was almost the party that was always in power, right? And that was considered a center-left party, even though it has been hawkish policies on different things in the past, but in terms of Israeli politics, was the more center-left party, which is also diminished in support. And the Labour Party decided not to form an alliance. Mirav Michaeli decided not to form an alliance with this Meretz party. And therefore, that was one reason why, if they had, you could have had at least 7 seats. Now you only have 4 seats for Labour, and you don't have Yesh Atid being able to try to form a coalition with these parties. Another reason is they were, in each of the several recent elections, saying, we're not going to meet the threshold, you're not going to meet the threshold, you have to vote for us. And a year ago, they still got 6 seats. So some people perceived them as crying wolf and that they were going to make it, and strategically voted for larger parties like Yesh Atid, the centrist party. So, right? So if you're trying to oust Netanyahu and you're trying to give the most votes to a party that might be able to compete with the votes that Likud gets, then you strategically might vote for the center party, the Yesh Atid party, but then you're not, this one party strategically ended up backfiring, right? Because this one party, you lost 151,000 votes by doing that. So those were some of the reasons that they did not, get the vote, among others, right? Then you had a second party that happened the same thing to in this bloc that was opposing Netanyahu. So you have 3 now Palestinian Israeli party, Arab Israeli parties, because it's not all Palestinians that are in these parties that are have been in the Knesset, right? One of them is Balad, which is a more Palestinian nationalist party that has tended to say we don't want to be in a coalition government with a Zionist party or something like that, and so that was its stance this time. You had the Ra'am party, which is an Islamist Palestinian Israeli party, which though wanted to have integration, focus on serving its constituents, and was in the previous coalition government. So it got past the threshold again. And then the third party is the Hadash party, which is a more communist party that is kind of more, it depends who's in the coalition as to whether we'll join it or not. They pass the threshold. So you have these 3 parties that sometimes have ran together in a coalition. And that's when sometimes they've won the most votes, like 14 or 15 seats. This time, because Balad did not meet the threshold, they only have 10 seats in terms of the Arab Israeli parties. And so the combination of losing the votes for Meretz and losing the votes for Balad created a situation that, despite the absolute voting patterns, you had a much stronger position for parties on the right and even the extreme right that we'll be talking about. So the likely coalition then that we're left with, given some of what happened with the bloc that was opposing Netanyahu, is Likud having the most votes, then forming coalition with 3 other parties or blocs of parties. 2 of them are ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. So one is, sorry for the students here, I know I'm throwing a lot of parties at you, and you're not going to remember every single party, but hopefully the main argument that's being told. So the United Torah Judaism Party is an ultra-Orthodox party. Only men are allowed to represent them in the party. And they're Ashkenazi Jewish ultra-Orthodox. So they have more European, coming from European backgrounds. And they often are concerned about their own schools, their own constituents in that way. Then you have Shas, which is another ultra-Orthodox party, but not all of the constituents are ultra-Orthodox. Some of them are just religious, but not quite as religious as ultra-Orthodox. And they're mainly Mizrahi, or Jews who came from the Middle East. So as many of you know, almost 1 million Jews after establishment of Israel, many of them were forced to leave the Middle Eastern countries they had lived in, which include Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, right? Baghdad used to be like the New York City of Iraq, where 1/4 of it was Jewish, right? And so they all came to Israel, and some of them, they are spread out, support different parties, but some of them disproportionately support Likud and support Shas. And so that, those are 2 of the parties, right, that we're talking about, and Shas ran on kind of, they have larger families, on food issues, hunger issues for their constituencies. And what's most concerning, actually, usually I try to be objective in my analysis, but there's a concerning element here of a religious Zionist alliance among 3 extreme parties. One is Bezalel Smotrich's National Unit Party. Another is Itamar Gvir's Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power. And a third is Noam, which is a reactionary family values list. Now, we saw that Labor and Meretz didn't form an alliance. The 3 Arab-Israeli, mostly Palestinian citizens of Israeli parties were not successful in forming an alliance. That's why 2 of them dropped. What Netanyahu intentionally and successfully did is really push these 3 parties to ally together and form a coalition, precisely so that one of them would not waste their vote, so to speak, by not passing the threshold if they ran separately. So strategically, he pushed that, and it was successful in terms of the support he was seeking from the right. The problem is that this coalition, which I believe won 12 seats, I'm just checking to make sure, are basically extreme far-right, actually 14 seats, extreme far-right, ultra-nationalist, racist, homophobic, and I don't often use this word, but /fascist parties that are problematic, and I'll explain to you why. But one of these, for instance, Ben Gvir, who heads the Jewish Power Party, he, as a teenager, supported the Meir Kahana's Kach party, which only had, I think, 1 seat in the Knesset or something, but was disbanded by Israel in 1944 for inciting racism and other things, and he is a kind of disciple of him. Secondly, he had a photo in his office until 2022 of Baruch Goldstein, who was a doctor who murdered 29 Palestinians while they were praying. It just is a chilling act of terrorism. While most people obviously condemn this as despicable, he had a photo of him as some kind of person he admires or hero. And I think he only took down the photo in the last 2 years because he recognizes that in order to get more support in Israel, he needs to tone down what he's saying and to be perceived as more legitimate. He also incited kind of for the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, who was assassinated in 1995. He wants to have kind of deport citizens who are disloyal to the state. He also wants to kind of remove more restraints that the police or military would be using. And he wants to completely kind of diminish the power of the Supreme Court, right? So I'm going to get to this kind of next, right, as to what the implications of then such a coalition would be. So you basically have Netanyahu, who had legitimized these far-right parties in order to get their support. So first of all, why did he do that? It's because he could be credited perhaps for certain things in terms of policy, discredited for a lot of things, I think, in terms of really delaying any kind of peace process with the Palestinians and obstructing it in many ways. But apart from that, his main driving motive is to stay in power, get power, and then also stay out of jail, right? So he's being prosecuted on several accounts. And so what he needs and what he wants is to pass a law whereby a sitting prime minister is immune from prosecution. And so he needs these parties and can count on these parties to vote with him so that he, as a sitting prime minister, won't be indicted. And then secondly, he wants to pass another law that you actually won't be able to be investigated when you're in a position like his for fraud and breach of trust, right? So this is his main motivation, right, for, in a sense, getting out of prosecution trials. And so he needs these parties who he knows will support him on these issues to be in the coalition. And that's one reason why he helped legitimize them and help them forge kind of an alliance of that kind. So what are the implications of this? I mean, one implication is that it's a real danger to Israeli democracy, right? And so you have a whole host of different scholars who categorize Israel in different ways. You have I think a smaller minority who would say it's not a democracy at all because it's occupation of the West Bank and so forth. You have a majority who say, no, yes, it is a democracy. We have to look at it within the 67 borders. It's a flawed democracy. And then you have different types of democracy, right? And I would characterize Israel as a hybrid democracy that has elements of an ethnic democracy, right? Some people characterize an ethnic democracy and that it defines itself as a nation state, as an ethnic state that sees itself as having self-determination for a particular ethnicity, and the symbols and culture of that state are focused on that majority, right? And so therefore has elements of an ethnic state, has elements of a consociational democracy in which there's power sharing. So there's sometimes power sharing with religious constituents and parties in the government. And it has components of a liberal democracy, right, which is focused on protection of individual rights, minority rights, and so forth, that are often protected by Israel's Supreme Court through their judicial review process. And so a danger in this particular coalition government is that there are parties that want to enact a law by which the Supreme Court, when it overturns legislation for being unconstitutional. By the way, Israel doesn't have a constitutional, just like constitution for a variety of reasons I can go into in discussion, just like England doesn't, but it has basic laws that act as a constitution. And so what the Supreme Court does is say it can overturn legislation as going against these basic laws. And what these parties want to do now is say we're going to pass a law by which, by a majority vote of the legislature, we can overturn anything that the Supreme Court says is unconstitutional, which essentially eliminates its ability for any kind of strong judicial review and seriously weakens that liberal part of that democracy. That not only has kind of implications domestically for Israel, but could also have implications internationally as other democracies view it. Now, again, we see kind of ultranationalist populist leaders in other countries, whether it's in Italy, whether it's certain parties in Sweden, whether sometimes in Brazil. So this is not something in our own country sometimes. This is not something that's completely unique to Israel. But certainly many democracies will say, hey, you know, what kind of democracy? Are you becoming a weakened democracy or a more flawed democracy? So that's one concern. By the way, before I go into more implications, I didn't speak as much as to why these parties did as well as they did, right? Which is a kind of surprising new factor. So let me just, you know, take a step back and talk a little bit about that. Why did, you know, some people vote for them. And a couple years ago, Ben-Gvir only got like 19,000 votes. So what happened, right? And so part of what happened is that you had other right-wing parties like Yamina and Bayit Yehudit. Some of them kind of have gone by the wayside, and their whatever 200,000 plus votes, some of those people ended up voting for Ben-Gvir. He also was very adept at kind of manipulating in social media, kind of fear, crime, personal security kind of issues. So in May 2021, when Israel and Hamas were in a war that you probably remember, there's hardly been any intercommunal violence within Israel itself, within the 67 borders. But during that war between Israel and Hamas, you had instances of intercommunal violence within the 67 borders in Israel, in some cities, where you had Jews assaulting and attacking Palestinians. You had Palestinians assaulting and attacking Jews, sometimes desecrating synagogues, etc. They were both happening. But of course, depending on what social media you're on, they only focus on threats of personal security by the other, not by your own group. And so that was going on in social media as, hey, you're no longer safe in these cities. What about crime? What about personal security? This was going on in social media. And that is one thing that captured people's attention. And of course, statistically, any time often you have violence or a focus on violence and war, it usually helps the right in a country as well. And then seemingly he also has, is good at making personal connections with people when he's out on the road and is a populist in that way and so forth. So people had different reasons for voting him. So I said one of the implications for this likely coalition is a real threat to democracy or the liberal parts of Israeli democracy. Another is that it will really influence the connection between religion and state. So because you have these couple of ultra-Orthodox parties and religious Zionist parties, they want to have less transportation on Saturday or Shabbat, right? They were being challenged in terms of the ultra-Orthodox having monopoly on what's considered kosher or not. They wanted to retain that monopoly. They want to have a monopoly on who is converted to Judaism through Orthodox ways, when now there was more attention to also accepting more so Reform and conservative conversions and things like that, right? So you're going to have an attempt to increase the connection between religion and state. You're also going to have a more monopoly on ultra-Orthodox curriculum and not introducing math and science, which also has economic implications for the country when you have a segment of the population that is not learning certain subjects that can strengthen the economy to a greater degree. You also have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who will try to incite and provoke and increase polarization in the society between Jews and Palestinians. And you have the challenge that Smotrich wants to be defense minister and Ben-Gvir wants to be the public security minister who oversees the police. Yet, both of them want to have less restraint on the military and police, and both of them are kind of provocateurs in different ways. So the mix of this can be highly dangerous. And could increase polarization in the country, could ignite, something like if Ben-Gvir or Smotrich want to go to the Temple Mount, it could ignite things internally, it could ignite things in terms of conflict with Hamas and so forth. So that is potentially dangerous. And if you follow that line as well, having this type of government can decrease the legitimacy for a two-state solution. So right now, over the past 25 years, I think there's been relative legitimacy for that within both populations to a significant degree, certainly internationally, even regionally with the Arab League. But it has reduced, given the stagnation in the peace process, that legitimacy has been reduced. There's still a plurality often of Israelis and Palestinians compared to any other single alternative that support a two-state solution. But a government like this and continued deterioration can certainly deteriorate that legitimacy further. which is a challenge. In addition to those things, we have in this coalition government the fewest women that there are in a coalition government. So there's only 9 women out of the 64 Knesset seats, which is 14%, partly because 2 of the parties are ultra-Orthodox that don't permit women to represent them, and partly because there's actually relatively few women on the Likud list. Whereas in contrast, the opposition bloc with 56 seats has 20 women, or 36%. It also, as I said, because of what happened to Balad, and because there's not even a higher Arab turnout, there's only 10 seats. And you also had often Palestinian and especially Druze join other Zionist parties, and that's happened to a less degree because Meretz also didn't get a vote. So actually there could be bleak kind of things both internally and internationally in terms of that could have implications for US-Israeli relations. Biden has said, President Biden, we don't really want Smotrich being defense minister and Ben-Gvir being public security minister. If Smotrich is defense minister, we're really going to have a very difficult time dealing with him and all the security cooperation that we do between our 2 countries. So they're trying to put pressure on this as well. If you think even of things that might happen with Iran in the future and tensions that may occur with a government like this, it could be more potential possibilities for potential increased tension and conflict and so forth. So I think of all the 5 lectures I've given in the 5 past elections, this definitely is the hardest one, I think, to talk about. However, I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm going to leave us with some hope in terms of possibilities for the future before I open it up to questions and we have a discussion. So one of them is that Netanyahu, despite everything, is cautious and risk-averse person. He's not really someone who wants to start wars or engage in wars or he's kind of more of a status quo kind of guy. He doesn't want to take risks for war generally, doesn't want to take risks for peace generally. I think a status quo can make things worse as opposed to staying stagnant. Nevertheless, he's not exactly wanting to, get into or provoke intercommunal conflict in Israel. He's not trying to get into another war with Hamas. He's trying to generally, most of the time, try to avoid those things. He's not, so in that sense, he certainly has an incentive to curb and try to restrain that religious Zionist alliance party in his coalition. He may very well try to say, I'm going to be defense minister myself. Sometimes prime ministers can also be defense ministers or pick someone else in the Likud. Certainly the US will be restraining and influencing what, the picking of ministers in the government and how it will deal with them. And certainly the Abraham Accords of the last 3 years or so will be a constraint, right? If you remember, one of the conditions for the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan for having normalization treaties with Israel was that Israel wouldn't annex any parts of the West Bank, which Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in this religious Zionist alliance want to do, right? So certainly they, and Netanyahu prizes the Abraham Accords. That will be another constraint on what this party may be able to do or influence in terms of the future. Also, there were rumors just today that, that possibly Netanyahu was talking to Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid party and Gantz's party in order to form a broader unity coalition. So it's not necessarily a likelihood, but it's a possibility that it will also potentially put restraints on that one party. It's not likely because both Lapid and Gantz could in different situations have become prime minister. Gantz, now they'll be in a worse position. Gantz lost a lot of support by joining a Netanyahu government when he said he wouldn't So it could be political suicide in some respects to do it, so it's not necessarily likely. Also, another reason maybe for kind of putting this in context is that this government may also not last that long. You don't know for sure because the parties within the right are pretty fractured, and there are demands that may or may not be able to be met. There might be defections from that because there also could be a backlash to this government, right? Because it is the most right government in Israeli history. There could be a backlash to it where next time around people are even more mobilized to vote in higher rates in the center, right, center, left parties. It could be that now they're more strategic about aligning with other parties. They don't lose any votes, but the right doesn't succeed in forming their alliance and loses votes. Whenever Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel vote in higher rates, if they were voting even 60-65%, that could make the difference in terms of what the next coalition would be. So there are reasons kind of to not think, oh, it's in a deterministic way that now this represents the future in terms of governments for the next 10 years or something in some continuing trend. It actually could be zigzagging given that the population's actual support, right, and what they want actually hasn't changed in an absolute way, right? It's actually what happened in particular parties not meeting the threshold that explains much of the formation of this coalition government. Okay, so that's enough. I know for some students it's a lot, but I want to open it up to questions, comments, challenges, and we hopefully can have a good discussion. So please don't be shy about that. Yes, come. And please ask your question at the microphone since it's live stream.
First question is, in Israel, the parties on the left and right, how do they differ on the threat of Iran destroying Israel with nuclear bombs? And the other question, if you'd like to handle it, the 4 congresswomen led by AOC in New York of the squad, and we got one in Detroit with Talib, what kind, and with all their anti-Israel and anti-Semitism, what kind of threat are they, and how powerful do you think how many followers do they have in this country? Okay,
so for the first question on Iran, certainly most Israelis perceive Iran as the greatest threat to Israel, right? It's besides Israel, it's the strongest military in the region. It rejects Israel's existence. It has quite often talked about annihilating Israel, and now missiles will have like, this is for you, Israel kind of thing on its missiles. So certainly in terms of, let's say, for those of you in international relations, when you're thinking how is threat composed, how is threat perceived, it's often capacity plus intention. And so for many Israelis, the capacity is there and the intention's there. So it's perceived by most Israelis as the gravest threat to the country. However, there's a lot of disagreement on what you do with that and how you react to that. And that you don't necessarily see the biggest differences among right and left on that issue. So for instance, both Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, who differed quite a lot in terms of the urgency and desirability of reaching a two-state solution, where Ehud Barak, who made a lot of mistakes, at least was serious about trying to reach a solution within a year, went to Camp David, and so forth, thought it was an urgent priority. And Netanyahu, not so much for a variety of reasons we can talk about. So they differ on that. In terms of Iran, they were both seriously considering attacking a potential nuclear facility in Iran, while one was prime minister and one is defense minister. So in that sense, there's not a strong difference. However, most of the military and intelligence establishment in Israel was saying no. There are too many risks and downsides to doing this. And most Israelis were saying, no, we don't want to do this without a green light from the United States. We don't want to, if you're going to do this, you don't do this independently against US wishes and so forth. And so on the Iran issue, it's not necessarily, I think there are a lot of people in the military intelligence establishment who oppose who oppose attacking any kind of facility in Iran. That being said, it's always a possibility in this new government that there could be less restraints, but that's not, it depends who's defense minister, who's in the security cabinet, and I suspect that the military intelligence would still often be very cautious about such a move. In terms of others and anti-Israel criticism, certainly there are some representatives who are more critical of Israel. Certainly, a representative in Michigan who's Palestinian origin. It's kind of understandable that she is not going to be a Zionist or so forth, and is going to be more critical. With a couple individuals, some statements they made have crossed into anti-Semitism. With others, they're anti-Israel statements that have not crossed into anti-Semitism. I think, they don't represent the majority of the Democratic Party, but they certainly represent, a growing skepticism and criticism of Israel, let's say, right? And certainly, I think with the current coalition government, that is likely to increase. And so, I mean, it's kind of, people who don't have any positive associations with Israel or the necessity or desirability of self-determination of all peoples, including Jews, might even like this new government in kind of that it kind of strengthens what they already believe about the state, right? This is what we always thought the state is. Now its true colors are coming to light, and that certainly can increase criticism. I certainly think that criticism of especially Ben Gvir and Smotrich is appropriate, right? I think it's appropriate for the Biden administration to say, we urge you not to have these two as ministers, and we would have a real problem meeting with one of them as ministers, right? So I think certain actions like that are appropriate. That being said, I would hope that often criticism comes from a place of, I forget who said this, whether criticizing Israel kind of brings you joy when you see this government, does it bring you joy, or does it make you depressed? It makes me feel depressed because I actually care about the country. If it brings you joy because you hope that the country would disappear, and this kind of strengthens what you almost want to happen in the country, then that is a different story. But certainly you're going to get more criticism. Some of that criticism is going to be legitimate criticism, given these two individuals who could be ministers in the government, and continued stagnation and so forth. On the other hand, I don't think they are representative of the majority of the population or necessarily where things will likely continue to go, although that's possible. Right? And certainly the way people react to them in a different way, there can be discussion, conversation as to how you handle this kind of situation when you're the US, right? And what are the best things for that. Any other questions, challenges, comments? Yeah, come.
Hi, yeah, I was just curious. I think I read somewhere, I think it was rates or something, that 53% of eligible Arab voters turned up to the polls. I'm just curious why those numbers are so low, especially because of the 2021 coalition. I would just assume that Arabs would feel some empowerment to go to the polls. So I'm just curious why those numbers are so low.
Yeah. So, I mean, historically, that's a good question. So historically, Arab-Israeli, which again, I think people often sometimes say Arab because they're not all Palestinian, but the majority are Palestinians. You could also say Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are different ways of referring to the population. Historically, it's always been lower than Jewish Israelis, right? Partly because some of them obviously Palestinians suffered from the creation of Israel, and even in the beginning of Israel, they were, first 20 years, they were under military rule. So they obviously have different mixed and sometimes negative feelings towards the identity of the state. So that helps explain part of it. Part of it is maybe that they had previous to this, even though they'd always been in the Knesset and always voted and always were able to run for the Knesset, until this most recent government, they had never been invited to be in a coalition government itself and had mainly been in the opposition. So partly maybe they thought our power is limited if we're not part of a coalition government. And you have, of course, different views. So on one hand, yes, it's low. On the other hand, it's 10% higher than it was before. And no one was calling in a big way to boycott the election. So for instance, often the mostly Palestinian Arab population in Israel can often determine who's going to be prime minister or not. So on one hand, they don't have relatively as much political power if they're not in the coalition government. On the other hand, because they're that 20%, 21% of the population, this time around, there were 70% who were eligible voters of that 21%. So in some ways, they have the power to determine who's going to be prime minister. So for instance, before 1996, when Netanyahu was first elected in 1996, Shimon Peres of the Labor Party was celebrating that he had won because the election was so tight. But because Peres had sanctioned an attack in Lebanon that mistakenly hit a civilian UN structure in error, the majority the Palestinian citizens of Israel decided to boycott the election in protest, and because they boycotted the election, Netanyahu was elected, right? So in a sense, they have a lot of power. Sometimes they've voted in far fewer numbers if they're actually boycotting election, sometimes in higher numbers. So certainly relative to Jewish Israelis, it's been lower, and the hope is that it will be higher still. And with parties like Ra'am, which is the Islamist party, it actually got more votes than the other two parties among Palestinian Israeli voters, and therefore, they're kind of a more integrationist party. So looking forward, you could have a tendency among some that no, look, we can have more power. We were invited to be in a coalition government. By the way, that's one thing that Ben-Gvir capitalized on, is like, oh, there was a backlash to that. But actually, Netanyahu had also invited Ra'am to be in a coalition government when he wasn't able to form a coalition. So it could be that even though there's been a backlash, you now have the legitimacy and parties on the left and right inviting Ra'am to be in a coalition government, which could potentially bolster higher votes among the Palestinian population in Israel, that actually they can have more power to do things for their constituencies through that. But you're also going to have parties like Balad who are kind of resisting even being part of a coalition and don't want to be part of a coalition. So on one hand, you're absolutely right. They have to, there certainly a lot of things need to be done also to further equality in Israel, to empower Palestinian citizens to feel like their vote matters and to go into the votes. There also, by the way, been dissatisfaction throughout the years about their own leaders and how much they're able to deliver and want to deliver for their constituents. So that has been an additional reason. That being said, if you compare it to American voting rates and voting rates into other democracies, does anyone know? We should know. I've looked this up before. You can, usually I hate when you have your phones, but you can Google it on your phone, how many Americans voted in the last presidential election. But yeah, it's definitely, if it's 60% rate, it's much lower than how Israelis vote, and the Arab Israeli vote is not that much lower than the American vote, or even white Christian American vote. So on one hand, things are relative. On the other hand, there's a great deal of improvement that needs to be done within Israel in terms of furthering equality and empowering all its citizens to vote. Other questions, comments? Yeah. Maria.
How are like the ministers like of defense chosen? Is that like what the prime minister appoints, or is there like another type of election for that? And then what, like if Ben-Gvir does get like that position, what are the like immediate concerns that like he will implement?
Okay, so they are appointed. The difference with the American system, right, is you have a party gets elected, and that party usually appoints people of the same party to be Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, et cetera, right? Once in a while, they let a member of the opposing party who's an incumbent continue, let's say as Defense Minister or Secretary of Defense. But usually in the United States, the people you're appointing are people of your own party who basically are going to agree with your positions and follow your mandate on which you were elected, right? In a parliamentary democracy, it's different, because you can't just appoint people from your party because your party didn't win enough votes, right, to form a majority in the coalition. So part of the bargaining of saying, yeah, you know, another party saying, I'll support you so that you can be prime minister, is you give me and my party, because we got 10 seats or because we got 15 seats or because we got 20 seats, you give me the second most important position in Israel, which is Minister of Defense, or then I want to be Minister of Finance, or I want to be another minister, right? So you're appointed by the prime minister, but the prime minister has less freedom than a US president does in appointing who those ministers are going to be, right? So they're definitely not elected, they're appointed, but you have constrained freedom in those appointments. Nevertheless, Netanyahu can choose someone of his own party. He can say, I'm going to be defense minister, or he can, if Smotrich really stands his ground and says, I won't, you know, support you, and he won't be able to form a coalition without him, he might potentially grant that despite his own probable misgivings, despite the military's misgivings, because he actually, you know, I think if I remember correctly, was a year doing Secretary of War. I mean, he doesn't have much military background, and he lives in a settlement in the West Bank, and he, you know, doesn't want to follow the current military rules of engagement and so forth. So I think there would be a lot of opposition, and is a lot of opposition to him. But ultimately, if Netanyahu thinks I can't be prime minister without him because I can't form a coalition with other parties, it's possible that he could do it. Now, what are the implications of that? You know, again, I don't think, I think they are much riskier in terms of his ability to not, when, you know, you always have different kinds of tensions, even, you know, like within the old city, which is 1 kilometer, and you have these beautiful mosques on the Temple Mount. You have the Western Wall, or Weeping Wall, that's the old retaining wall of the Jewish temple. They're right attached to each other. Some Jews then want to pray on what had been in religiously their holiest site, even though some rabbis say it's so holy you shouldn't go there. So it's a hotbed of tension as it is that can sometimes spark into different things. And so if you then have someone you know, who thinks that you know, less compromising, less restraining, there could be sparks that then escalate under someone like him, which is very concerning. Now, maybe Netanyahu would be able to restrain him because he still can't act independently without the military and completely against what the prime minister says, and has to act within a security cabinet. Nevertheless, it certainly would be more concerning if he was defense minister. Yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
You mentioned the certain far-right parties raising concerns of security, but I was wondering what were the failures or perceived failures of Lapid and Naftali Bennett that, you know, perhaps led to this or contributed to it, that people think this new coalition might compensate for?
Okay, that's a great question, right? Because there are obviously people who criticized the former coalition government and felt like it wasn't delivering in different ways. So certainly one point of contention is that some on the right think that Netanyahu has been unjustly targeted and indicted for corruption and bribery and other things. So they think it's politically motivated and it's not accurate. I mean, it's not too difficult to look at analogies in our country about that, right? Where some people think Trump should have been impeached, or that Trump has done illegal things or whatever, and others in the United States say, hey, you're accusing him unfairly, he's a victim of the leftist media, you know, et cetera, and feel like there are groups that support this leader who's being targeted is somehow being unfairly kind of targeted by a biased legal system or biased media and so forth, right? So in a sense, right, there are similarities in these situations as to having such polarization around a figure and some who support him not taking the legal accusations or other kinds of accusations seriously and saying, hey, you know, our guy is being unfairly targeted. And so some of that was happening in terms of the indictments against Netanyahu and therefore opposition to that. Some of it was, even though Netanyahu at one point was willing to have this Palestinian Islamist party in his coalition, some on the right, it was anathema to them that Lapid brought in the Ram party into the coalition. How could you have a party that has had ties with the Muslim Brotherhood in a coalition? They can't be trusted, and in these wars, or, you know, who are they going to be siding with? So there's a lot of distrust, and because unfortunately there is an external kind of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know, outside of the 67 borders, that for many Israelis, but especially on the right, unfortunately, for many Israelis, unfortunately, you know, some citizens are suspect. Who are you siding with in this conflict? Are you siding with our enemies in this conflict, right? So that turns into unfortunate suspicion and division. And so some of that was a reaction against Lapid inviting Ra'am into the coalition. And then there's the sense, like I said, of personal security, like, oh, you know, have you done enough to provide personal security when there's this crime and other things? Again, they're completely different situations, completely different contexts. But if you look at our recent election, right, and like why people were voting in different parties, it seemed, let's say, crime was higher for Republican voters than it was for Democratic voters. And here you see a similar thing. Crime is higher for the parties on the right in terms of their priorities and their motives for voting, and less so for Lapid. So they think like that when Lapid was prime minister, he didn't do enough, you know, about personal security and crime. And so those are three of many reasons why there was dissatisfaction, you know, with that government. Yeah, Sam.
I have two questions about the Israeli left or anti-Netanyahu group. One is, you made the point that their total number of votes was, the two blocs was essentially identical, but the seats in the Knesset are not. Have the parties, the anti-Netanyahu parties, learned a lesson from this? Have they been talking about that, about how they won't make that mistake in the future? Or is it too soon to have a discussion?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent question. It's not too soon. Right away, you have the who's to blame, you know, for this, which, like, again, because the elections happen so quickly, so close to each other, blame for Meretz not meeting the threshold. Is it Meretz itself? Is it Labor? Is it Yesh Atid because maybe they were, you know, more aggressively getting votes for themselves and not helping the smaller parties as much? So there's a lot of a blame game going on. And of course, you have the also underlying conditions as to why there aren't more voters for Labor and Meretz, for instance, in Israel. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but certainly part of it is the stagnation in the peace process and then the second intifada from 2002 to 2005. So you had, part of their main priority and that articulated their agenda was getting a peace agreement and the establishment of a Palestinian state and assuring peace on its borders, and the diplomatic efforts didn't bear fruit. Then you had I think not entirely fairly, because it's not all of the story, but you had their own Prime Minister Barak saying Arafat's to blame. You had President Clinton saying Arafat's to blame, and Israelis loved Clinton, and so they, in their narrative, thought they were seriously pursuing peace, and then they got, weekly suicide bombings. So that violence kind of, as you probably know, really weakened support for the left, because then if that's their main agenda item, why vote for the left when some people perceive there's no immediate partner for peace? I personally think there is a partner for peace, but certainly there are a lot of challenges, like with Hamas and Gaza and so forth. So a lot of people who even support a two-state solution say it can't happen right now. We tried, but then people are like, well, then why vote for the left, right? They failed to deliver on some of their main agenda items. So that's part of the underlying conditions where you have fewer people voting left and them having a harder time now articulating what is the main thing they stand for. Now with Meretz, it's still peace and individual rights and civil rights, and some people are lifelong voters for Meretz, but others are, there's been a growth in centrist parties, either center right or center left, and away from the strong left.
So the other
Israel.
thing, I read
Yeah.
some columnist in the New York Times saying that the anti-Netanyahu groups really don't agree on much other than that they dislike Netanyahu.
True. That's true. And that's one of the reasons the government collapsed and one of the reasons they had a hard time opposing him. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, come on, that's a question.
I also have two questions. First, according to your numbers, about 1/6 of the voters were Palestinians and other non-Jews, and they only got about 1/12 of the seats. Is that because they couldn't agree on a common bloc?
Yeah, so first of all, even though they're 21% of the population, 17% are an age, voting eligible age, right? So you have 17% of the population that was voting eligible, and you only had half of that, 17%, or a little more than half of that, who actually voted. So certainly, of those 55 or so percent that voted, it had Balad, right, made the threshold, which it almost did, and had they voted together in a block, then they definitely would have had at least another 3 seats, if not 4 or 5, and they would have, and possibly Netanyahu wouldn't be prime minister and certainly wouldn't have this right coalition. So the question again is why? And so part of it is, and they had run together before, and part of it is just they're very different parties with different constituencies, with different agendas, so it's very hard in order to compromise to reach that coalition. So for instance, some of the differences are religion. I mean, Ra'am is an Islamist party and the other, Hadash, is a communist, party. Part of it is whether you want to be in a coalition government under what conditions. So Ra'am is in a coalition government with right-wing parties in Israel. Balad is like, there's no way we would even be in a coalition with left Zionist parties in a coalition government. So there are a lot of things that they disagree on, yet in previous years they had agreed to vote, to align themselves together, and by doing so, they definitely got more seats in the Knesset. So that goes back to the previous question too, that one answer is higher voting rates, another answer is actually managing to form a bloc in order to increase one's seats. But that's very hard, and the Zionist left has also not been successful in aligning together, even though Labor and Meretz, for instance, have a lot more in common than they don't have in common. And even they weren't able to align themselves as well as a
My
bloc.
other question is, what, if any, effect do you think will have the fact that that AIPAC, the largest pro-Israel lobbying group in the United States, supported a number of Republicans and opposed a number of Democrats? What, if any, effect do you think that will have on American relations with Israel?
Yeah, so basically, for many, many, many years, supporting Israel, not in an uncritical way, but supporting Israel in terms of being an ally with, that's a fellow democracy, with some common interests, etc., was largely supported in a bipartisan way, often by over 74% of Americans, by both Republican and Democratic members. Increasingly in the past few years, that bipartisan support has been eroded to some extent for a variety of reasons. One is that Netanyahu himself kind of aligned himself more with Republicans and spoke in Congress in opposition to one of Obama's main policy agendas concerning the Iran nuclear deal that he had worked hard to achieve, right? And so that, and both he and Obama had worked in some sense to undermine each other politically, right? So that it was a contributor, right? Netanyahu himself, in terms of playing upon partisan politics in the United States. And then certainly AIPAC lately, although, it has, arguably, depending on your politics, right, has done some good things in trying to continue support for Israel to have be military more powerful than its opponents in the region. So depending on policy, that has been the long-standing bipartisan U.S. policy, right? But on the other hand, it can be criticized for perhaps not doing enough to pressure Israel on issues of settlements and things like that, because their stance is always support the Israeli government, no matter what, it's a democratically elected government. So certainly they've been playing more in their effort to be bipartisan and support both Republican and Democratic representatives. Certainly they have been challenged in some of the Republicans that they have supported, right? And whether they themselves are undermining bipartisan support to some extent. They've also been, there's kind of a lot of talk within the Jewish community about how much there should be opposition to Ben Gvir and Smotrich, where you have the reform and conservative movements publicly critiquing this extremist party. And you don't hear that, I don't think yet, from AIPAC, because their traditional stance has been, okay, it's a democratically elected government, we just support whatever government's elected, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, as opposed to seeing support as also, you can have critical support where you also can criticize these particular kind of far-right, racist kind of parties. And so, yeah, there's a lot of controversy and debate and dialogue about that, but certainly there's many factors that have contributed to a weakening of bipartisan support for Israel. And when I mean support, I don't necessarily mean uncritical support, but just critical support as well. Yeah, two last questions, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. And then if you want to stay for more, yeah.
Good evening, Professor. So within your talk, given the trajectory of, like you've said, the past 5 elections, you highlighted how there's been a real shift towards the center. But with this past election, how there was the most extreme government being elected in, what do you personally believe is the trajectory that you feel is happening in coming years and coming elections? Will it continue to move more far right, or do you believe that with the overall movement towards the center, will that happen?
That's a great question. Of course, political scientists are worst at prediction. We have a hard enough explaining things that happened in the past. much less predicting what will happen in the future, and we've actually been quite horrible at that. So like predicting the nature and timing of the end of the Cold War, largely did a bad job. Predicting like the Oslo Accords in the Middle East in 1993, did a poor job of predicting it, and then after it happened, they're like, oh yeah, of course, all our theories would have predicted it. So we're not good at this. But I would say that I don't necessarily think it's a likelihood that the extreme right will keep growing. It's always a possibility. So what factors would make it possible? One is you have in many countries around the world this kind of nationalist, populist kind of appeal. So some young Israelis even have gone more to the right, and some even to the extreme right. What explains this? Maybe they like more provocative people who are good on social media and aren't relying on other sources of news, perhaps. Maybe they feel disaffected by other parties their parents have voted for or want to rebel against them. Maybe also the continuing Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that can, as I think violence on both sides can create support for more extremes, right? Unfortunately, at times, and there's also less contact between Israelis and Palestinians, and so that fosters that. So there are a whole set of reasons why you have, I think, a growth in some people going to the right, becoming more racist as well. That's being legitimized in some quarters, which is tragic. So there are some of those trends that are extremely concerning. That being said, I don't think it's deterministic in any way. As I said, still polls show that most Israelis, if they think there can be a peace agreement and would be a peace agreement and for a secure peace agreement, will withdraw from the vast majority of the West Bank. We've talked recently in a class about ideas of confederation and other kind of ideas, but still most Israelis say, or many or plurality of Israelis say that. And I don't think, certainly most are appalled by the votes that this party got, But interestingly, there's an age and generational break too that it's younger people, kind of your age, that sometimes are, moving in that direction, which if you look at the long term, if that continued, and if you look at the demographics of ultra-Orthodox having more children, that's not going to necessarily speak well for the reemergence and growth of the center-left in Israel. So you have those concerns that, is there this continuing right trend, which could be a longer-term trend. On the other hand, I also think that often things work in a pendulum, and there are backlashes to this kind of thing. Even if you, in extremely different circumstances, in our country, you see kind of moves between parties, so it's not deterministic, and there are still things that can happen domestically and externally that then influence the situation, which I think very much could still kind of rejuvenate, re-strengthen the center-left as well. So I don't think it's deterministic in any way. And I think that though people can be thinking about both within Israel and here, how can we foster kind of, and in many different ways, there are different schools in Israel for both, not many, but Israelis and Palestinians, where you have dual Hebrew language. You have now in the USAID in the State Department, $250 million allocated for development in Palestine, but in cooperation with Israeli, engineers and other things, and developing people. So I think there are a lot of grassroots, a lot of positive things happening as well on the ground that we don't pay as much attention to, and that we can strengthen and grow as well. So I still am optimistic, but certainly things can get a lot worse. They can get better. And you can have simultaneous trends going on simultaneously, and I often think that that's what's happening. You have simultaneously trends that are moving to the right, but also people from the right who are moving to the center, and you have simultaneous things going on. But that's a good question. Okay, you can ask the last question. If you could ask it at the microphone, because it's being live streamed, yeah.
So there seem to be like a lot of similarities between politics in the U.S. and in Israel, but I guess like what makes Netanyahu, like why has he been able to win so much? Because I know that like, and I don't know how much Jewish citizens in the United States and Jewish voters, like I know it's like usually a very strong voter bloc for Democrats. So then I'm just kind of confused, like, why is like a far right leader like Netanyahu so successful in Israel? And then like, is there just, because I know that like in the 2020 election, there are a lot of dissatisfied like independents and some Republicans that didn't like Trump and Netanyahu seem to share a lot of similarities. So like kind of referencing to the other question earlier about how like the anti-Netanyahu parties, they kind of seem to not have anything in common except getting Netanyahu out of office. Like where do those trend lines go? I guess one, for how Jewish voters vote in the United States, and then two, do you think that there might be like a movement to the center? Again, it kind of leans on the last question, but and if so, if there is a movement more to the center and the center left, how do you think that bodes for peace talks between two states, Israel and Palestine, and just the Middle East in general?
Okay, lots of great questions. Thank you. So yes, you're right that Jewish Americans have always voted in high numbers for the Democratic Party. So I think in the very last election, it was 74% for Democrats, which is probably a higher proportion than any other population except for African American, Black Americans who vote, I think, in even higher rates for the Democratic Party. But they're certainly one of the populations that vote in very high rates for the Democratic Party in the United States. So you think, okay, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I think one reason is as a minority in the United States, they have been very active traditionally in the civil rights movement and other things, partially out of empathy for other minorities and partially as a way to protect themselves as a minority in the United States, partially perhaps, the reform and conservative forms of Judaism were kind of created in the United States, and perhaps that has an influence as well. I mean, there could be all kinds of influences that feed into that. So why Netanyahu in Israel? So for one thing, again, it's good to keep in mind that it's not as if you have a majority of Israelis who support and like Netanyahu. So despite the fact that he has been the longest prime minister, often he is only getting 28% of the vote or 29% of the vote or 30% of the vote, right? So the majority of Israelis don't vote for Netanyahu, don't want to vote for Netanyahu, and don't like Netanyahu for a variety of reasons, right? Arguably. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind, not to kind of inflate his popularity. But why, nevertheless, he has retained, stayed in such a long-term way is partly his experience. People see him because he's been a prime minister for so long. Many people think, oh, he's a statesman, he knows what he's doing, he has experience. Partly he's a good communicator, and has that skill, so he communicates well with people. I don't know if sometimes you've seen on American TV, you might disagree with them, you might agree with them, but he's a good communicator in terms of his media presence and stuff, and has practiced that a lot. Partly he has done things like there is a free newspaper in Israel that's were funded partially by people in the United States that are very much supportive of him in the media. So sometimes the free paper that people can read is not that critical of Netanyahu. And so the media, plays a role into how they cover him and what he's covered. In fact, one of the charges against him is he tried to bribe a media outlet that they would get certain things if they covered him positively. So that's another reason. Another reason is that historically the Labor Party was the most popular in Israel for the first 30 years, but it was dominated by Ashkenazi Jews, or Jews who had come from European background, and those Mizrahi Jews from Middle East countries felt like they had been shut out and they had been discriminated against by the power and party that was also represented by another power. So a lot of those people, or some of those people, disproportionately went to the Likud party as a critique of the Labor Party and them being shut out of the Labor Party. So then they have a loyalty to the Likud, no matter whether the prime minister from the Likud is Mizrahi or not, but just traditionally kind of as part of an identity moving to that party and then getting infrastructure and strongholds for that party in their communities. And partly is that he kind of builds on a kind of anti-establishment. If you feel marginalized in society, it's the elitist media, it's the state institutions that need to be challenged, and and part of that dynamic goes into it as well. Part of it, at different times, he's had successful policies. At times, he's had done successful things for Israel's economy. Sometimes it's increased disparities between wealth disparities, so there's been kind of problems, but it's also, Israel is now one of the OECD countries. It was, I think, rated 17th in the UN Human Development Index, right? So in terms of its economy, its educational and health institutions, it's been quite successful. It has the highest number of startups per capita in the world. So some people have credited him for part of that, or when he was finance minister for that. So there are a lot of reasons. Okay, so that some people vote for him. In terms of whether there would be centrist parties again, and what that might mean for Israeli-Palestinian peace, as some of the students in my class know, I think that there's been so much progress in previous peace negotiations among lots of years and thousands of pages written, that over the years you had people who have been part of these peace negotiations, whether they're Israeli Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was part of the peace negotiations, or Saeb Erekat, who for years was one of the main Palestinian negotiators and peace negotiations. They would say privately and publicly, we already have made the peace deal in a sense. We know what it's essentially going to look like. We've spent thousands of hours negotiating it. What we really need is political leadership to actually take the risks of actualizing it and to compensate for our weak institutions, and we need an active mediator or mediators to help us overcome those institutional obstacles, but we pretty much know what it would look like. And so I think that gives me hope that that in actuality, people can go back at one point to 2008 with the last very serious negotiations, and they don't have to start from scratch when you get the right combination. And it's interesting to see who will be the right leader in Israel to be able to forge an agreement. I don't think it'll be Netanyahu. Who will it be on the Palestinian side? Does Mahmoud Abbas, I think, could be a partner for peace, but he's really suffering. He's 87 now or so, suffering weak legitimacy. There haven't been elections in a long time. If you look at his successor, maybe Marwan Barghouti is very popular. He's in an Israeli jail right now convicted for planning terror attacks. But if he was put on an election, or if he ever was released, he would be the one who's popularly voted. No question, surveys show. And even though he was, used violent tactics in the Second Intifada, he's for a two-state solution and might have the legitimacy and power to actually implement it and take the risks of implementing it. So I think there is hope there, but it's also going to be a long road, a real challenge with ups and downs, because there are spoilers who want to spoil that and play into fears and such from both sides. But I hope that we will see that sooner rather than later. But so thank you so much. I'll stick around if anyone has any other questions or anything like that.
The cabinet is not yet.
No, no.